Hey, good evening, John Mayfield. I want to welcome you to the broadcast. Hopefully, I'm broadcasting loud and clear and live. I'm uh, going to check my iPad, so I should be popping up on there just any moment now, and I will know that I am broadcasting loud and clear. So, if you have, I'm going to just double check my couple of things here. So I appreciate you. I'm broadcasting from my hotel room, and so I have the comments on to where you should be able to hear me, and I'm not seeing anything here on my live TV. So I'm over on my YouTube channel, but nothing's coming through. So might have to just wait a quick second here. And I'm going, oh, there we go. Looks like I'm going through. So just wanted to make sure that was coming across on my YouTube channel. So I want to thank you for joining. I'm broadcasting from my hotel room, and I'm on the road traveling, doing a course for the Real Estate Negotiation Expert course, part of the REBI. And we're doing that I'm doing that in St. Charles, Missouri, which is not far from my home, but I still wanted to do a live stream tonight. Now, you can still ask a question, and I'll be able to see those on the screen right now, so feel free to do that. I am going to also at times go over to my screen where we can talk about some of the items there that are on the screen. So hopefully everything's going okay. If not, I apologize. This will not be a long live stream tonight. I want to be able to review for tomorrow. And then after I finish tomorrow's presentation, I drive 20 minutes over and do a closing keynote presentation for the Home Inspectors Association here in Missouri. So I've got a busy day tomorrow, and I appreciate that. But I do want to go over a few items that we need to talk about for the real estate exam. I've actually gone through the first 7 chapters. And by the way, I just also want to just explain why I'm doing this strictly on YouTube tonight and not Zoom. It allows me to be able to stream this to my YouTube channel for other students to be able to watch. And when I do this on Zoom, because I have many of my students that are on the camera, I just feel like for your safety benefit and for other issues, I don't want everybody in the world to be able to see those of you who are online. So that's kind of why I chose to do YouTube tonight, is that you can still watch, listen, participate, but it allows me to be able to send this out on my YouTube channel, and you do not have to be going out live with your video and everything else going out. So anyway, I hope you appreciate and understand that. So I've been trying to go through the material. We've gone through the first 7 chapters. Last week we went through chapter 8 a little bit. I think actually we went through most of 8, and then we jumped into some questions. Or I say last week, it was a couple of weeks ago. So tonight I want to go through chapter 9 very briefly, and you can see chapter 9 on your screen right here. I'm going to kind of jump over. We were talking about encumbrances, and you can see the first slide. I always like to remind my students is that all liens are considered encumbrances, but not all encumbrances are liens. Now, keep in mind, a lien is anything that affects the title to the real estate. So when we say all liens are encumbrances, well, a lien affects the title to the real estate. So all liens are encumbrances. but not all encumbrances are liens, okay? So, an easement. If someone gives you an easement to use a piece of land, that is considered an encumbrance. Even though you might not say it's a negative issue with the property, it still affects the title to the property. So let's look at some of these that are listed here. Easements, restrictions, another encumbrance. You could have air and water rights, encroachments, licenses. All of those are considered encumbrances. They affect the title to the property. You know, when you buy a piece of real estate, you want to be able to use that real estate in any manner that you would like to see fit. Now, we talked about the fact, or we've mentioned, that when you buy real estate, you own it free and clear. However, we talked about Uncle Pete, which is Uncle Sam's brother, right? Police power, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. The government has the right to take your property, private property, for the good of the public, and there are certain things that have to be met. We talked about that. Just compensation, due process of law, and it has to be for the good of the public. So eminent domain is a taking of private property for public use. Taxation is the right for the government to tax your property. For the county, that may be for the school or for hospitals, various things like that. Escheat is when you die without heirs and without a will. Your property will escheat or go to the state. Now again, no heirs and no will. And then we talked about police power, which is the government to zone property, place building restrictions, and other types of occupancy requirements before you can move into that property, or how you use the property. So, to back up, you own the property, it's yours, you can do whatever you want to with it, except for Uncle Pete. You gotta abide by zoning laws, right? Building codes, occupancy requirements, police power. You gotta pay taxes, taxation. Your property could be taken from you by the government for condemnation purposes. But there are requirements that have to be met. And if you die and you don't have any heirs and you don't have a will, your property will go to the government. So Uncle Pete kind of is that government arm that puts some requirements, stipulations on that real estate. However, you could put stipulations on the real estate when you sell it. Or perhaps you've purchased the property from someone else and they've put some stipulations, restrictions, an easement, other types of issues there. So those are all considered encumbrances, okay? Now, one of the things we talk about for the exam is this thing called an easement. And with an easement, we can have what is called a dominant tenant and a servient tenant. I like to think of the servient tenant as the person who is serving you, okay? In other words, I am allowing you to go across my land. The dominant tenant is the person who's actually using that easement. They're dominating the situation. So that's kind of how I like to remember those, okay? Now, I have an easement example here you can watch in your notes where I draw this out. We're going to move past that. Whoops, I'm on the wrong. We're going to move past that. Since we are doing this from a my screen, and video will not run very well. So when you have an easement, and I don't know if I could stream this over from my iPad or not. I wish I could draw this for you. But you generally will have someone who might have a roadway or an easement that would be along part of your property that allows them ingress and egress to their property. In Missouri, for example, you cannot have land that is landlocked. Now, that doesn't mean the courts couldn't require you to pay money for that easement. In other words, if I owned a piece of property right here, and your property was back here, hopefully you can see that, and there was a roadway here, and there was no way for you to get back to your property except to go across my land. Well, if you asked me for an easement and I said, no, I don't want you to use my land, I don't want you to go across my land, you could take me to court and you could appeal to the court that your land is landlocked and you need access to your property. The court might require me to give you an easement or grant you an easement, but they also might require you to pay me some money. Now, they won't ask you that on the test, but I just want you to know that that's an example of how an easement can come about. Excuse me. Sometimes I've got the air turned off in my hotel room, so probably need to turn it on. So in that case, you have a dominant tenant, which would be you, because you're going across my land, and I would be the servient tenant. You got to know those terminologies. They will ask you that. They will give you this in a scenario-based form. Now, you also have to think about, and we will talk about in a minute, how an easement can be created and how it can be terminated. Okay? Now, in this slide, we talk about an easement in gross. An easement in gross. This is usually like a utility easement. So with an easement in gross, you only have servient tenants, or tenements, as sometimes they estates, because we are all allowing the utility company to go across our properties. Okay? So they could ask you that question on the test. Just remember, easement and gross, only servient tenants. They love this question here, easement by necessity or an easement by prescription. A lot of times this is when, and we see this a lot when you have a garage that was built over the property line, or there's a situation where the only way to really remedy that is through an easement by necessity. I was on city council years ago as a city alderman for the city of Deloge, and there was a gentleman who built a new home in Deloge. And true story. So what happened was, it was a new little a new little addition. This guy had bought some land, had 6 lots surveyed. Great builder, great guy. He had this little cul-de-sac. Was just a small piece of ground in the city. He had a cul-de-sac built, and the guy he hired to put the rock down went out and dumped the rock for the cul-de-sac, for the road. I'm on city council. I'm also a real estate agent, and I was also involved in this transaction. So the guy just dumps the rock for the road. The road where they had kind of sketched it out was not in the right place as per the survey for the plat. Therefore, when the guy dumped the rock on the road, it wasn't really in the right place. Well, the builder knew what the setback lines were for the city, and measured 20 feet, I think is what the setback line was, measured 20 feet from the edge of the rock. Well, remember, the rock wasn't on the right spot. Therefore, when we sold the home, which required a survey, because it was spot survey, that we called them spot surveys. And by the way, they asked that question on the test, or I've seen that. It's called a mortgage survey or a spot survey. It's not a full-fledged survey, but it is a survey that kind of just gives you a ballpark idea where the property's at. So when we did this mortgage survey, it showed the road and the setback lines were not correct. Well, upon further investigation, we've discovered what happened. And the road that they blacktopped and everything was not in the right place. Well, it was a mess. And that would be a good example of how an easement by necessity could be created. I think what actually happened in that case, and I can't remember exactly, it's been years and years and years ago, is that the developer had to have that whole thing replatted, resurveyed, and properly corrected to match what was done there. But always get a survey and understand that there can be some remedies for situations like that. So easement by necessity, you could have what's called a prescriptive easement. And that is an easement by prescription is when you own a piece of property for a certain length of time. So if you had a driveway that was on the other person's land and you used it for a certain length of time and no one ever stopped you, the court would probably grant what is called an easement by prescription because you've used the property for so long. Now, those terms can be a little confusing. I've always known them to ask at least one question from those. So just look at the differences. Easement by necessity arises when an owner has no access to his or her land. Property cannot be landlocked, therefore an easement by necessity arises. An easement by prescription is when the court will grant an easement because you've used it for a certain length of time, okay? Now, in Missouri, the time frame's 10 years, but it's different for every state. They won't ask you that specifically, but they will want you to be able to identify what an easement by prescription is. And by the way, I have a footnote there. You can also acquire property that way, and we call that through adverse possession. I want to make sure and see if there are any questions. So if you have any questions, be sure and type those in. I'm going to very quickly go out to my YouTube channel and just double check out there and see if there are any questions. They're supposed to generate and come through right over here on my screen, but just to verify and make certain. I see a thumbs up there. So any questions you have, feel free to ask those, and be glad to answer those. And I'd love to see if somebody's watching, regardless on what platform, to see if this actually works where they come through. So you could say hi or whatever. We're not going to go a little bit, not too much longer. So you can also get an easement by adverse possession. Now, what if I use the land for 5 years and then sell it to somebody and they use it for a certain length of time? Could they get an easement by prescription? And the answer is yes. And that term is called tacking. They tack onto that property. So that question is true. Now, I would definitely know this slide in your notes. How's an easement created? Through reservation. You reserve an easement. So my wife and I own our home, and we have an extra lot next to us. Years ago, the first time we owned the home, we bought it, we purchased it back again, so we've owned it twice. The first time we purchased the home, we put in a koi pond with a waterfall. We've always loved it. It was very nice. However, part of this garden area where not the waterfall itself, but where some of the shrubs and the rock and some of that is actually over on the second lot. But I've told my wife it's not a big deal, because if we ever wanted to sell that lot to somebody, we could just reserve an easement for that 4 or 5 feet that goes over onto their property to the other lot. So a lot of times people will reserve an easement. When we say through grant or through the use of a deed, that's when I physically give you an easement. I'll give you an easement, a 20-foot roadway easement on the edge of my property so you can get back to your property. And so we call that through grant, and that would be through the use of a deed. By necessity, your property's landlocked. By long-term usage, in other words, you've used that parcel of property for years. Open, notorious, we call it hostile. Nobody's ever stopped you. And so, again, in Missouri, if you did that for long-term usage, after 10 years, you could go to the court and ask for an easement. And through implication could be another way for an easement. Terminating an easement when the parties merge together. So in other words, if you owned the property behind me and I gave you an easement to use your property behind me, and then you bought my property, they merged, that would terminate the easement. Or if I bought your property, that's a merger, that would terminate the easement. By abandonment, no one's used it for 30 years, and you can document that and have proof of that. You put a gate up and no one ever cut the lock off. You could go to court and say, I want to terminate this easement because it's basically been abandoned. No one's using it. When the purpose no longer exists, perhaps you were back behind me, needed that easement to get back there, but now they've built a highway that goes through your land or next to your land, and you have access right to the highway. You don't need to use my easement anymore. So when the purpose no longer exists, through adverse possession, really the same thing as abandonment there. That may also be where I gave the example that I put a gate up and, put a garden across your easement and you didn't use it. and I had that there for 10 years, I could use adverse possession as a way to terminate the easement. And then through excessive use. If you use that easement back and forth, I could go to the court and say, look, I gave this person an easement only to use it for certain situations. They got a darn nightclub back there, and there's hundreds of cars going back and forth. So the court could stop that through excessive use. You can also terminate an easement by non-use, destruction, release. I just sign a deed as the dominant tenant, or you do, as I'm using you back there. You sign a release and say, I don't want your easement anymore. I don't need it. That would be one way. And then through a lawsuit, such as when a person attempts to quiet the title. That would be another way. Sorry about that pop-up there. Now, they love this question on the exam. A license. You may very well see this. A license is not really any kind of... a license, first of all, can be terminated at any time. Anytime you go to a professional sporting event, you have a license to go on to the ballpark or the football stadium or to the concert. And if they don't like anything you do, they can boot you out, okay? And that's why they can make you leave the facility. But licenses, you might see the question about someone that was allowed to park their car or to hunt on some property, but there's no kind of easement recorded, and it's just the personal privilege to use someone else's property. That's called a license. And they love that question right there on the test, okay? So make sure you know the difference between a license and an easement. And I just kind of mentioned here about licenses and when you go to a baseball game or a football game. An encroachment, another question they love on the test. This chapter has a lot of questions. An encroachment is anything, write this down, anything that extends over the property line. Okay? There's a question that has been seen that says, which of the following is an encroachment? And the answer is a tree limb hanging over the property line. So if you have a tree on your property and the tree limb hangs over someone else's property, that is called an encroachment. So again, anything that hangs over the property line is an encroachment. Now, the only way you can discover an encroachment is through a survey. That has been an exam question. So the only way you can discover an encroachment is through a survey. Anything that hangs over the property line is considered an encroachment. Well, I believe that is all of the material. There's several questions we have. I have some flashcards and then a recap. But if you do not mind, I have a big day tomorrow. I have some more preparation and review today. I've spoken all day long. My throat feels fine, but I think it's a good time for me to probably wrap up tonight. I am looking here to see, and I do not see any other questions. So I'm going to believe that everybody's okay, but you can always write me if you have questions. And I'll be back live streaming from my studio at home next week. Thanks so much for joining. I hope you have a great evening, and I will talk to you later. And by the way, check us out, globalrealestateschool.com. We're always here and happy to help you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.